Well, we're and I'm very honored and very fortunate to be able to introduce our panel today, this afternoon. It's the last panel of the afternoon. And of course, it's on diaspora, but this time on visibility. And that should be quite interesting. A lot of the papers will be on the Levant, which is a region where I have lived in my youth, but I know very little about, and I'd love to hear what people have to say about it. But before I go any further, I was asked to remember to tell you at the end, and since I will forget, I better tell you now, that tomorrow the symposium starts at 8:30 for coffee, and the panels will start at 9 o'clock. So in case I forget after the panels, this panel, please remember what I just said. So this panel is really quite exciting, really. We have four very interesting people presenting. We have Mr. Simon, Dr. Simon Jackson, Dr. Wendy Perlman, Dr. Sosi Kesbarian, I have to pronounce properly, and Mr. Andrew Simon. So we are very pleased to have these persons here, and let me just, I mean, you have the papers in front of you with their name, but I just had a couple of small things I wanted to say. Here we are. Now, Simon Jackson teaches actually in Paris these days, right? And so we're very pleased to have him travel all the way from France to discuss this. He's at Sciences Po and at professor also at NYU, which has a very impressive campus in Paris. So, he will really talk about from more of a historical perspective, and I hope he will maybe bring this forth into today's problems in the region, but he's going to talk about the diaspora of the Syro-Lebanese, in the League of Nations. And so that will be and how they are related with the French mandate in Syria and Lebanon. That's very, very interesting stuff, really. Wendy Perlman is at Northwestern University, and she will be talking about the competing for the diaspora in Lebanon in particular, where the groups in Lebanon have a problem. If they emigrate and make a lot of money for their home groups, then they don't have enough people to vote for the group in Lebanon, and I think that's a very interesting topic. Dr. Kesbarian got her PhD from SOAS, which is, of course, an extremely well-known school, and she's now teaching in Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh, if I'm not mistaken. And she will talk about the Armenian diaspora. And finally, Andrew Simon, who is just graduated from Duke University, and I might add that Andrew, who may not have a PhD yet, is one of the very bright young scholars around. In fact, he has just been accepted at the program at Georgetown University, and if I recall well, he was the highest ranked person we accepted this year. So we're trying to flatter him to actually join us this year. So, and he will talk about a very, very interesting topic, the I-Copts. And I will let him do that when he comes to it, because it's a very interesting concept of what's happening. So perhaps we will start in the order that was presented here, and maybe with Simon Jackson, if we may. And each speaker will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and I told them I'd be ruthless.
So thank you to our chair, and I'd like to thank also the CCAS here at Georgetown for organizing this symposium and creating this forum for debate at an extraordinary time in the Arab and, of course, the wider world. The theme of this particular panel is visibility, and I hope that my presentation will approach in a historical register some of the same questions that I know Wendy, Sosi, and Andrew will subsequently address in more contemporary contexts. I want to talk today about how the Syro-Lebanese diaspora, broadly construed, tried to influence the political economy of Mandate Syria-Lebanon during the years of French control in the 1920s especially. In particular, I want to address the way in which the League of Nations operated as a forum and as an amplifier for debates on these questions, rendering both the debates themselves and the main debaters more visible. The evidential foundation here is primarily the mass of petitions that accumulated at the League in Geneva. The petitions were sent there and translated there from all over the world. And I'll return to the question, the very open question of translation in closing. To give some context, my presentation is drawn from my current book project, which is based in turn on my PhD dissertation. And it's a larger analysis of what I call mandatory development. Essentially, my focus is divided into three main issues. First of all, the discourse created by French business, academic, and political groups to imagine, explain, and justify France's role in the Middle East, and especially the economic dimensions of this discourse. I'm very interested in breaking down Homo economicus, as it were, and rerouting him in his cultural narratives and contexts. Second, I look at ways in which the development concept was a double-edged sword, and I draw here quite a lot on the work of Fred Cooper in West Africa. Of course, it served as an imperial project, but it could also be used, I argue, and adapted by Syro-Lebanese groups, including in the diaspora, to make their own case for their own visions of economic development. Finally, I look at the international and transnational dimensions of this process, in particular the role of the League of Nations in Geneva as an institution that allowed for the production of new political and economic norms and that amplified forms of protest and resistance in a newly visible way. In particular today, I want to argue that diaspora communities were a especially privileged locus and actor in such claim-making around economic development. This was due to their simultaneous distance from and also intimacy with the Mashriq. This tension created a strong sense of narrative possibility, enabling different protagonists to imagine development very differently. In doing so, of course, they were much helped by the technologies of their day, the cutting-edge technologies of their day, the telegram and the steamship, and I know we're going to hear more about technology a little bit later on. These technologies reconfigured space and time in new ways and changed the scale and the spaces of political activity. Syro-Lebanese people in the diaspora incarnated this evolution. They were an essential part of mandate politics and economy, constantly in touch, but without living inside the new borders. Their commercial acumen and capital investment were praised and sought after by French officials, but their political involvement proved far more contentious. French government officials and their allies and Syrian, Lebanese, and Arab nationalists all appealed to the diaspora in the 1920s, applauding its supposed wealth, praising its political sophistication, and prophesying its massed return to the Mandate territories. To illustrate and develop the argument, I want to offer three main examples. The first is around the Syrian Legion. The second is around economic petitioning from the Americas in the 1920s. And finally, I want to close out by looking more closely at the League of Nations and its Permanent Mandates Commission at Geneva. So the first example concerns the French attempt to create a so-called Syrian Legion during World War I. And I begin here because I think it draws out some of the key dynamics of the relationship that I want to discuss. The Legion was a military unit that was to recruit its soldiery among the Syro-Lebanese diaspora of the Americas, which was a delicate diplomatic and military project at a time when those people were neither subjects nor citizens of an allied country. The episode helps us to understand a recurrent dynamic in the politics of the Mandate diaspora, namely the French tendency to homogenize and characterize the diaspora to best suit French purposes, and on the other hand, the diaspora's own tendency to resist and reconfigure the French perspective to suit its own, always multiple, agendas. The Legion's creation was shaped by French interest in obtaining military resources for a Franco-British campaign against the Ottomans, and some Paris-based Syro-Lebanese diaspora groups, keen for influence and a role in the war effort, also backed the Legion as proxies for the French government. Loyalty to the Entente forces, anti-Turkish sentiment, potential post-war rewards, and the politics of recruitment were intimately bound together here. One group in particular that was strongly associated with this drive was the Paris-based Central Syrian Committee, led by Shukri Ghanem and Georges Samneh. Another was the New York City-based League for the Liberation of Lebanon and Syria. Both organizations, founded in June 1917, claimed as a main goal the recruitment of volunteers to fight under the French flag in what some called the Legion of the Orient. George Samnay later described the enterprise as a success. He noted that 2 envoys had been dispatched between June 1917 and February 1918 on a consciousness and fundraising trip to South America, paid for by the French state. There they had raised 100,000 francs in Brazil and subsequently moved on to Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. But the Paris Committee did not necessarily represent the wider variety of diaspora perspectives and was consequently subject to criticism. This is exposed partly by the questions diaspora Syro-Lebanese asked about the Syrian Legion scheme. In a question and answer exchange published in the colonialist newspaper Correspondance d'Orient in April 1918, Shukri Ghanem answered questions from a Brazilian Lebanese group called the Renaissance Libanaise de Sao Paulo. The exchange contained 2 particularly telling passages. First, the Paulistas asked to what extent the Paris group was dominated by Francophile Maronites. Second, they wanted to know whether there were, in fact, as French propaganda claimed, tens of thousands of Syrian legionaries already based in Cyprus, waiting to attack. To the first question, seeking to position his organization as an ecumenical and authoritative institution within the wider diaspora, Ghanem replied that the Central Syrian Committee in Paris aimed to represent a wider, greater Syrian agenda and was by no means a vehicle of the Christian Lebanese mountain. To the second question, on the other hand, he was forced to admit that between 1916 and 1918, only 550 Syrians had been recruited to the Legion, alongside around 4,000 Armenians. Their military role, he added, could only depend on broad Allied priorities in the Eastern Mediterranean. Behind this admission, however, correspondence between French diplomatic representatives in Paris and Rio, and between War Ministry representatives in Cyprus and Paris, reveals more specifics. In particular, the official portrayal of Syro-Lebanese recruits resonates strongly with later Orientalist French official characterizations of mandate subjects. French officers represented the recruits as generically mercantile and generically individualist, best deployed as commercial auxiliaries to French power, but in a military context, a bad influence on 4,000 apparently far hardier and far more committed Armenians. So the failure of the Syrian Legion reflects, I think, fundamental dynamics between the diaspora and the different groups seeking to mobilize it in this period. The French government, encouraged and steered by pro-French diaspora groupings in Paris, who I argue shouldn't just be seen as puppets or proxies, lost money and their high hopes, but certainly not their prejudices. The wider diaspora communities, meanwhile, responded with questions, mixed attitudes, and considerable hostility. In the 1920s, this pattern was sustained, in my second example, diaspora criticisms of French mandatory economic strategy, and I turn to some of these now. In 1919, French officials reckoned the diaspora to include perhaps 1 million people, divided primarily between North and South America, West Africa, Egypt, and France. Diaspora groups remitted, as we know, a good deal of money to the Levant, and this flow was widely commented on by intellectuals and officials at the time. For the most part, Lebanese intellectuals especially criticized the, quote, remissions crutch, end quote, which was seen as an obstacle to economic viability. Articulated in different ways, however, such capital could be welcome. For example, the French Information Bureau on the Levant deployed the stereotype of a congenital Syro-Lebanese orientation to business to declare, quote, the Syro-Lebanese colonies of the Americas are and always will be first-rate commercial agents, since they are such fine businessmen. Already they support French commercial expansion. They can do much more and build up outlets for French products. They can contribute to the vulgarization of Syrian products and to the progress of tourist propaganda. This last is salient, since tourism seems likely to become a more and more important source of wealth for the mandates, end quote. So cast by French officials as a reserve army of flexible fixers, these natural, apparently borderless entrepreneurs were nevertheless supposed by the French, in their discourse, to possess a form of national imperial loyalty. Further, this loyalty was allegedly supple enough to make them both the developers of markets for French goods and the distributors of Syrian goods. The emphasis on diaspora financial power came at a moment in 1922, in particular, when French policy was increasingly to avoid expenditure as far as possible in the face of criticism in Paris and the Parliament especially. The diaspora would therefore allow for development on the cheap. The French Information Bureau continues as follows, quote, The Syro-Lebanese, of whom many make their fortune once they emigrate, own quite considerable material resources that could finance by themselves, or nearly, the economic development of their country of origin by sending the requisite capital there. If we suppose that only a tenth of them, 100,000, could invest a few thousand francs in each of the industrial and agricultural businesses that will regenerate Syria, one sees what prosperity they could guarantee the country." End quote. French official discourse therefore envisaged the diaspora as investors in the regeneration or reinvention of Syria after World War I. What made this notion of regenerative investment viable without risking any loss of French power was precisely the idea of the diaspora as wealthy and politically distant. In the French imaginary, the diaspora could therefore act not only as commercial agents to French businesses and ideas, but also as silent and silenced partners in the mandate's imperial political economy. As the situation in the Mashriq grew ever more overtly politicized through the 1920s, so the allegedly apolitical, allegedly rich diaspora increasingly became a proxy for French officials keen to discover friendly and pliant constituencies. Such characterizations, of course, reveal far more about French mentalities and French analytical conventions than they do about the diaspora's real relationship with Syria-Lebanon. The diaspora in practice were far from the investor shareholders of an economized mandate politics. And here I'll just move forwards a little bit, but I want to talk about the Druze communities of the United States and their funding of the Great Revolt in 1925, which provoked a good deal of anxiety in French diplomatic circles. For example, the French ambassador in December 1925 here in Washington, D.C., told his chiefs in Paris that the Druze had committed, the Druze in the USA, that is, had committed $8,000 in support of the revolt. This was something that went down even worse in Paris, given the exchange rate, which then favored the dollar very much against the franc. Druze American funding of the Great Revolt was not the lone instance of the violent tenor of diaspora politics and its uncertain interaction with the various efforts to mobilize it. As early as 1920, a group called the New York City Party for the Liberation of Syria circulated a pamphlet to the Syrian community there. It stated that the French had come to Syria unwanted and uninvited, that even in 1919 only a few misguided Lebanese had been pleased, and that even they had since repented. Cataloguing what it described as the crimes of the regime, the pamphlet focused on political economy. It noted that national companies had been allocated to French interests, thus, quote, depriving the indigènes, end quote, and that more generally, quote, the concessions of the country are an easy target for the colonizers, and they farm out such businesses like a feudal privilege to those indigènes with whom they're most pleased, end quote. The violence of such a position was rhetorical. It used the language of French colonialism, and especially the highly charged term indigène, to signal a distance between the diaspora in New York City and Syro-Lebanese still in the Levant, even as it spoke on behalf of the latter. Second, more directly, the pamphlet declared diaspora contempt for those Syro-Lebanese whose collaboration with the regime had earned them access to concessionary opportunities. This example demonstrates how the critical freedom and distance enjoyed by diaspora communities could also permit the obliteration of distinctions and the easy deployment of categorical condemnations or solutions that were less than obvious in the mandate territories themselves. Turning now away from New York City and the direct politics of the diaspora to Geneva, I want to wrap up by looking at the operation of the League of Nations in the mediation and the magnification of the mandate in its political economy. Susan Peterson at Columbia has recently argued that the mandate system was more, quote, a mechanism for generating publicity and norms than a system of governance, end quote. League oversight, she continues, proliferated information and publicity about the mandates and offered legitimacy to those powers who complied with the system's formal requirements and professed to uphold its norms, end quote. So she sees the League as a sort of factory for the production of new norms that could legitimate state actors if they conform to them. I want to go further than that and argue that the League and its Permanent Mandates Commission also offered opportunities to Syro-Lebanese groups, notably in the diaspora. Petitions received from the Syro-Lebanese diaspora were read by League officials, and they informed the questions those officials then asked of the French government. These questions, in turn, elicited answers that were made public by the League in its public minutes, or else were leaked to the Global Press Corps in Geneva. They were then seized on by Syro-Lebanese groups as grist for further petitioning. So I want to describe a kind of loop of publicity and visibility that passed through Geneva and on around the world. For example, a petition of 1933 from Syrian nationalists of the National Bloc in Damascus, which was relayed to avoid French interception via telegram from Haifa. It stated, in the wake of High Commissioner Henri Ponceau's declarations to the Mandates Commission, that, quote, the Mujahideen held numerous meetings in Damascus during which they studied the declarations made by the High Commissioner before the Permanent Mandates Commission, end quote. So this loop of publicity and critique did not function with the immediacy of the internet and internet mechanisms that we've seen at work in recent months across the Arab world, but it was effective nonetheless. Further, its ability to function was enhanced when the subject was economic. The withdrawal of the US from the League and the well-known story of great power manipulation and management of the League meant that the League of Nations increasingly defined itself, as the 1920s went on into the 1930s, as a hub of technocratic management. Timothy Mitchell has argued that the League, for example, was instrumental in producing a new world of national economies and generating the statistical norms that were crucial to creating that world of national economies. A typical early petition is a memo of November 1921 from the Syro-Palestinian Congress, a Syrian nationalist group that was one of the most active Syro-Lebanese petitioners to the Mandates Commission. It had a permanent presence in Geneva through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in one instance, in March of 1922, there was a quasi-official meeting in Geneva between a PMC member, Permanent Mandates Commission member, and a member of the Syro-Palestinian Congress. The report is as follows. The representative was said to violently resent the cession of Syrian territory recently by the French to the Kemalists, which deprived Syria not only of essential economic resources, but also of her natural frontier on the Taurus. Economically, they complain of the burden of taxation and of the threat of exploitation by French capital, which is being granted dangerous monopoly privileges. Mr. Jabri, who is the source, mentioned particularly companies involved in large-scale flour milling and road construction. The buying up of all available grain threatened Syria with famine. Some in the population favored absolute and unqualified independence, others, of whom Mr. Jabri seemed to be one, while anxious to have the independence of the new state proclaimed, recognized the necessity of European advice and continued technical assistance, end quote. Other diaspora critics argued in their petitions that France was itself so weakened that it could not deliver on promises of economic development at all. For example, a 1926 petition from the Syrian American Society of the United States, again sent from here in Washington, D.C., stated, quote, the French have suffered financially during the war to such an extent that they have not the means to restore France itself or to develop what possessions they have already. They cannot, therefore, give Syria the financial and economic support she needs, end quote. Moreover, petitioning on economic matters drew on a series of modular examples and adopted then-current global hierarchies of development. Petitioners argued that, on the one hand, Eastern European League of Nations members were no more advanced than Syria or Lebanon. The Genevan SPC noted in one petition, quote, independence and admission have been granted to Georgia, Estonia, Lithuania, Lithuania, Albania, and Armenia, which states are neither more developed nor more important than we are, end quote. On the other hand, the same developmental logic encouraged the recycling of developmental arguments with a strong element of colonial racial hierarchy, as the same petition continued, quote, the abandoning of our people to these mandatory powers can at a pinch be explained in 1919 by a war mentality that wrecked political judgment. It's now time to return to reality and renounce this factitious assimilation of peoples who just cannot be compared to the blacks of Africa. The Syrians cannot allow their country to continue to be cited in a list of countries under mandate rule alongside Cameroon, end quote. In so arguing, the SPC reappropriated the notion of the inherently commercial character of the countries of Syria and Lebanon. But in the SPC version of this narrative, the much celebrated commercial abilities of the Syro-Lebanese had been suppressed by the dead hand of imperial domination. The same line of reasoning, however, by accepting and deploying the stereotype of the inherently commercial Syrians and Lebanese, also accepted the racial stereotype of African backwardness. Here again, economic reasoning found its roots in cultural and racial characterizations. Finally, the International Press Corps was strongly present in Geneva and reported on the activities of the League and its Permanent Mandates Commission, republishing minutes of meetings and leaks that stoked further petitioning. But it also provided a direct platform for diaspora voices. The Manchester Guardian, the forerunner of today's Guardian newspaper in the UK, for example, featured an interview conducted in Manchester, in England, in December 1925, with a Beiruti businessman who owned businesses in London and Manchester. He stated, regarding the Great Revolt then ongoing, that, quote, "Our feeling is simply this. We feel aggrieved that the government brought on all this trouble without taking the precaution to see that it was itself supported by sufficient military force. We had next to no army in Lebanon at the time, and even now a good deal of the defense work in the Lebanese raided villages is being done not by the authorities, but by volunteers from among the inhabitants. We feel that the League of Nations ought to ensure that if we have a mandate, at least the mandatory power should be in a position to defend our lives and property," end quote. Despite the best efforts of French power to restrict petitioning from Beirut or Damascus, petitions continued to pour in to the League from the interwar diaspora, addressing all sorts of topics. And through the loop of publicity and pressure described above, I argue that the League therefore constituted not just a factory for new norms of state behavior, but also a platform for protest, prefiguring the Algerian FLN's use of the United Nations in the years around 1960, as described, for example, by Matthew Connolly. This is not to attribute to the diaspora a unity or coherence that it manifestly lacked in multiple respects. Instead, it underlines the way that mandate rule, thanks to its structural uncertainties and its external nexus in Geneva, helped to mobilize diaspora communities to an important degree. This was even the case when those communities or individuals remained skeptical about the League's credibility or its ability to influence events in a specific or direct style. Finally, just a point on translation. The Permanent Mandates Commission did translate most of the petitions that it received, but it didn't translate all of them. And in particular, while those in Arabic were always translated, I've seen administrative correspondence which shows that they didn't have a regular Armenian translation service. And the boxes at the League of Nations archive contain piles of untranslated Armenian petitions, which I wasn't able to read, but I think are a precious resource. Despite this qualification, I conclude by emphasizing the utility of an approach that includes the diaspora and its efforts to mobilize by means of multilateral institutions. Such an approach helps to broaden the analytical field of mandate political activity out from the dualism of metropole and mandate towards the acknowledgement of, to coin a phrase, a worldwide web of actors. It also shows how forms of reform imperialism were vulnerable to appropriation by subaltern constituencies. French control of the mandate was therefore menaced not just by direct and brutal failures of its practice and ideology, as in the Great Revolt of 1925. Thanks to the activities of the diaspora in particular, French control was also threatened, paradoxically, by the success of French efforts under the eyes of the world at Geneva to concentrate attention on the ostensibly less controversial matter of economic development. Thank you.